Welcome to my updated deep dive on Daenerys Targaryen and Azor Ahai. This analysis is going to consist of multiple parts. In the first few parts, we're going to be talking about the Azor Ahai returned prophecy and how Dany, with no knowledge of the prophecy, organically fulfills it when she walks into the fire and births her dragons. And in the later parts of the series, we are going to be unpacking the mythos around Azor Ahai, Nissa, and the forging of Lightbringer. And that's when we're really going to get into the meat of why Lightbringer is a metaphor for dragons, why Nissa's willing self-sacrifice was the element necessary to forge Lightbringer, and how we see thematic similarities all throughout Dany's A Game of Thrones chapters, leading up to and culminating in her rebirth, the birth of the dragons, and the forging of Lightbringer. So Dany fulfills this prophecy by birthing her dragons and forging Lightbringer at the end of A Game of Thrones. And we do not hear the Azor Ahai prophecy until A Clash of Kings, and we get it from Melisandre. In the ancient books of Ashai, it is written that there will come a day after a long summer when the stars bleed and the cold breath of darkness falls heavy on the world. In this dread hour, a warrior shall draw from the fire a burning sword, and that sword shall be Lightbringer, the red sword of heroes. And he who clasps it shall be Azor Ahai come again, and the darkness shall flee before him. Azor Ahai, beloved of R'hllor, the warrior of light, the son of fire. There will come a day after a long summer. We know that that day has come because in the prologue of Clash of Kings, we're told the Citadel has declared this great summer done at last. 10 years, 2 turns, and 16 days it lasted, the longest summer in living memory. And it's worth noting here that the first few bits of A Clash of Kings were originally a part of A Game of Thrones. And so it's very much implied that this announcement that summer is over is happening at about the same time that Dany has birthed her dragons. When the stars bleed, just before lighting the pyre and birthing the dragons, Dany sees a comet and she takes it as an omen that her ritual is going to work. The first star was a comet burning red, blood red, fire red, the dragon's tail. She could not have asked for a stronger sign. Then, in A Clash of Kings, we're told that Dany's Khalasar, the Dothraki, name the comet the Bleeding Star. And they name it the Bleeding Star, having never heard the Azor Ahai prophecy. And we get that language about the Dothraki naming it the Bleeding Star before we get the prophecy. And so it's very much being set up that when Melisandre is giving us this prophecy, thinking it's attributed to Stannis, we're supposed to be like, I think I've heard this story before, actually. Like, you're supposed to go, when the stars bleed, oh, the bleeding star, oh, Dany's dragons. Something else I find really interesting about the language is that it's plural. Stars is plural. And we do see another bleeding star in Dany's story directly leading up to the birthing of the dragons and forging of Lightbringers. So this is from Dany 7, A Game of Thrones. My son and stars is wounded, Drogo. A flap of bloody flesh and skin dangled from his chest like a wet rag. This is a star bleeding, and his wound is what leads to all of this, like, coming about. As in, if he had never been wounded, if that star never bled, this would have never happened. When the cold breath of darkness falls heavy on the world. Dany has a dragon dream just before this scene, and she is introduced to the growing darkness. Quote, the red door was ahead of her, and she could feel the icy breath behind, sweeping up on her. If it caught her, she would die a death that was more than death, howling forever alone in the darkness. Then again, in the House of the Undying in Clash of Kings, Dany looked behind her. The torches were going out, she realized with a start of fear. One more guttered out even as she watched, and the darkness came a little farther down the hall, creeping toward her. And as she listened, it seemed as if she heard something else coming, shuffling and dragging itself along the faded carpet. Terror filled her. So Dany is being introduced to the darkness, the others. And in this dread hour, Drogon is known as Balerion the Dread come again. And this is an excerpt from A Clash of Kings. Dany is talking to her Khalasar, telling them a story. Aegon rode Balerion the Black Dread. The Dothraki looked at her hatchlings uneasily. The largest of her 3 was shiny black, his scales slashed with streaks of vivid red scarlet to match his wings and horns. Khaleesi, Aggo murmured, there sits Balerion come again. So this connects Drogon specifically to the Azor Ahai prophecy. Then again, in the House of the Undying and A Clash of Kings, Dany is told 3 mounts you will ride, 1 to bed, 1 to dread, and 1 to love. The mount to dread being Drogon, Lightbringer. A warrior shall draw from the fire. We see Dany walk into the pyre. Unafraid, Dany stepped forward into the firestorm, calling to her children. And she draws forth dragons. She was naked, covered with soot, her clothes turned to ash, her beautiful hair all crisped away, yet she was unhurt. The cream and gold dragon was suckling on her left breast, the green and bronze at the right. Her arms cradled them close. The black and scarlet beast was draped across her shoulders, its long, sinuous neck coiled under her chin. So she walks into the pyre and draws forth from the fire dragons. And draws from the fire a burning sword. Xaro tells Dany, when your dragons were small, they were a wonder. Grown, they are death and devastation, a flaming sword above the world. And he's saying death and destruction because, like, he's in a really bad position with the dragons. Like, you gotta contextualize that a little. But we are given this metaphor that dragons are a flaming sword above the world. Now, this is from Davos 1 in A Clash of Kings, and he's thinking to himself, a true sword of fire, now that would be a wonder to behold, yet at such a cost. When he thought of Nissa Nissa, it was his own Mera he pictured. He tried to picture himself driving a sword through her and shuddered. I am not made of the stuff of heroes, he decided. If that was the price of a magic sword, it was more than he cared to pay. So the first thing I want to call attention to is him saying it would be a wonder to behold a true sword of fire. Because over and over again, Dany's dragons are referred to as a wonder. First, in A Game of Thrones, something else came crashing down, bouncing and rolling to land at her feet. A chunk of curved rock, pale and veined with gold, broken and smoking. Dany heard women shriek and children cry out in wonder. Viserion hatches, children cry out in wonder. In A Clash of Kings, Quaithe tells Dany, beware of all. They shall come day and night to see the wonder that has been born again into the world. Dany won A Storm of Swords. In all the world there were but 3 living dragons, and those were hers. They were a wonder and a terror and beyond price. Tyrion 3, A Storm of Swords. Sailors back from the Jade Sea report that a 3-headed dragon has hatched in Qarth and is the wonder of that city. Prologue, A Feast for Crows. Dragons and darker things. The gray sheep have closed their eyes, but the mastiff sees the truth. Old powers waken, shadows stir. An age of wonder and terror will soon be upon us, an age for gods and heroes. Then, if that was the price of a magic sword, it was more than he cared to pay. Dany absolutely paid the price. Dany ate A Game of Thrones. There is a price, the god's wife warned her. It is not a matter of gold or horses. This is blood magic, lady. Only death may pay for life. Someone threw a stone. No, she wept. No, please stop it. It's too high. Price is too high. Dany ate A Game of Thrones. You warned me that only death could pay for life. I thought you meant the horse. No, Mirri Maz Duur said. That was a lie you told yourself. You knew the price. Then just before she mercy kills and sacrifices Khal Drogo, she says, forgive me for all I have done and all I must do. I paid the price, my star, and it was too high, too high. Then we have, that burning sword shall be Lightbringer, the red sword of heroes. It's red for 2 reasons. It's red because it's hot, it's a flame, but it's also red because it required blood sacrifice, the blood of Nissa Nissa. In Davos 1, A Clash for Kings, he's having a conversation with Salladhor Saan. We will get really far into that when we get to the mythos of Azor Ahai and the forging of Lightbringer, but part of what he says is, her blood and her soul and her strength and her courage all went into the steel, the red sword of heroes. So he's referring to Nissa Nissa, and he's saying her blood, the red sword of heroes. Then in Jon 3 of A Dance with Dragons, I looked at that book Maester Aemon left me, the Jade Compendium, the pages that told of Azor Ahai. Lightbringer was his sword, tempered with his wife's blood. Now, in A Game of Thrones, Dany 3, she has her second dragon dream, and it's just her and the dragon. The dragon is black, it's Drogon. There was only her and the dragon. Its scales were black as night, wet and slick with blood. Her blood, Dany sensed. So this is a clue-in, a foreshadowing that Drogon specifically must be brought forth from her own sacrifice. And while I believe that Red Sword of Heroes is directly referring to red for Nissa Nissa's blood sacrifice, most people in the fandom take this to mean that it is, because a sword, when it is being tempered in fire, it glows. So a sword, a burning sword, would be glowing like coal, at all times. Because a lot of people in this fandom take this prophecy like so literally, and the mythos very literally, that it has to be a man with a sword, that he literally actually plunged through a woman's heart. Like, it's all taken so literally. And yet, even within the constraints of this very literal interpretation, Drogon fits. Most Valyrian steel was a gray so dark it looked almost black. So, Valyrian steel aflame would appear red and black. The largest of her three was shiny black, his scales slashed with streaks of vivid scarlet to match his wings and horns. And again, the black dragon raised his head hissing and unfolded wings of night and scarlet. Drogon spat swirling red-black flame. So the way that Drogon looks is also how you would describe Valyrian steel aflame, or burning red. And along this line, just something I found so fascinating when I was reading again this time. In Brienne 1 of A Feast for Crows, she's looking at Oathkeeper, and Oathkeeper is Valyrian steel. Black and red the ripples ran, deep within the steel. Valyrian steel, spell forged. It was a sword fit for a hero. She is literally describing Drogon. The last was black as the midnight sea, yet alive with scarlet ripples and swirls. That's how Drogon's egg was described. So ripples is being used in both of these descriptions. And then that she says Valyrian steel spell forged, a sword fit for a hero, that also fits Drogon. He is alive because of Valyrian spells, because of Valyrian blood magic, and he is a sword fit for heroes. Next part of the prophecy is, he who clasps it being Lightbringer, shall be Azor Ahai come again. This is Dany 9, A Dance with Dragons, the first time that she mounts and rides Drogon. Her hands clutched at his scales. Dany could feel the heat of him between her thighs. She's clutching him with both her hands and her thighs. Her bare thighs tightened around the dragon's neck. Like, George is making a pretty big to-do about the fact that she doesn't have a saddle and that she is quite literally clasping on to Drogon. And the darkness shall flee before him. In Dany's last dragon dream leading up to the birth of the dragons and forging of Lightbringer, she senses the darkness, but upon waking the dragon, which is herself, it flees from her. The door loomed before her, the red door, so close. The hall was a blur around her, the cold receding behind. She threw open the red door and saw her brother Rhaegar mounted on a stallion as black as his armor. Fire glimmered red through the narrow eye slit of his helm, the last dragon. Dany lifted his polished black visor. The face within was her own. So she's felt the cold creeping up behind her. She's running for the red door. And when she gets there, she throws it open. The cold recedes behind her. And what is behind the red door? The true last dragon, Dany. And I love this so much because she doesn't know this, but we do, that at one point in time, Rhaegar believed that the Azor Ahai, Prince who was promised prophecy, was referring to him. So that she sees him as like the thing that the darkness is fleeing from, only to discover that it is actually her. Like, come on. And then it wraps up with a couple of like monikers, like titles. Beloved of R'hllor, the warrior of light, the son of fire. So, beloved of R'hllor. This excerpt is from Melisandre 1 in A Dance with Dragons. R'hllor spoke to his chosen ones, another way of saying beloved, through blessed fire, in a language of ash and cinder and twisting flame that only a god could truly grasp. Melisandre had practiced her art for years beyond count, and she had paid the price. So is this telling us that R'hllor speaks to his beloved through a language of ash and cinder and twisting flame, and that understanding it comes at a price? So he speaks through blessed fire. The blessed fire that he speaks to Daenerys through is the pyre. Now, not only is a pyre in and of itself a sacred fire, but Daenerys goes on to describe this ritual and the fire as a wedding. The flames writhed before her, whirling and singing and spinning their yellow and orange and crimson veils. Dany opened her arms to them, her skin flushed and glowing. This is a wedding too, she thought. The flames were so beautiful, the loveliest things she had ever seen, each one a sorcerer robed in yellow and orange and scarlet. She saw crimson fire lions and great yellow serpents, and unicorns made of pale blue flame. She saw fish and foxes and monsters, wolves and bright birds and flowering trees, each more beautiful than the last. She heard a crack, the sound of shattering stone. Dany was showered with ash and cinders. Only death can pay for life. When the fire died at last, Ser Jorah Mormont found her amidst the ashes, surrounded by blackened logs and bits of glowing ember and burnt bones of man and woman and stallion. She was naked, covered in soot, her clothes turned to ash, her beautiful hair all crisped away, yet she was unhurt. So you have a beloved of R'hllor, which is Dany, being spoken to through blessed fire, which is the pyre, in a language of ash and cinder and twisting flame. We see the twisting and writhing flame, and we get her showered with ash and cinder. Melisandre speaks of the price of understanding this language, and we get in that scene, only death can pay for life, as the dragons hatch. And earlier, in Dany 1 of A Game of Thrones, Illyrio said, "May the Lord of Light, R'hllor, shower you with blessings on this most fortunate day. Shower you with blessings." Dany was showered with ash and cinders, a language of ash and cinder. The next moniker is Warrior of Light. When you break down the name Daenerys and its origins and where it comes from and what it means, Dae, D-A-E, in Korean means shining, the great one, or greatness. It represents bravery, strength, and a warrior-like character. Nerys in Welsh means lady. So we've got shining lady, shining warrior. Next is Son of Fire. Dany says, "The fire is mine. Daughter of dragons, bride of dragons, mother of dragons, don't you see?" Then we're told, "For dragons are fire made flesh." So when you put that together, daughter of dragons equals daughter of fire made flesh. Now, in Davos 3, A Storm of Swords, we get another version of the prophecy that is similar but different. It is written in prophecy as well. "When the red star bleeds and the darkness gathers, Azor Ahai shall be born again amidst smoke and salt to wake dragons out of stone. The bleeding star has come and gone, and Dragonstone is the place of smoke and salt." That's Melisandre who's saying that. And of course, everything that she is saying, all of the versions of the prophecy, the information about the prophecy that she conveys, is in her mind about Stannis. And that creates this very effective, dramatic irony in which we're reading it knowing it's Dany and she's attributing all of it to Stannis. And I'm going to go through so many examples of her offhandedly saying things, thinking that it's about Stannis, but it's actually fitting Daenerys. So the first part of the prophecy is redundant to the first version of the prophecy that we receive. It is "the red star bleeds," which is just another variation of "when the stars bleed." Similarly, this has "darkness gathers," where the first version had "the cold breath of darkness falls heavy on the world." I'm more interested in the additions that this version is making to the prophecy, which is "Azor Ahai shall be born again amidst smoke and salt to wake dragons out of stone." Born again. Daenerys experiences both metaphorical and literal rebirth. Metaphorically in her dragon dreams, and then literally in fire. We do not get a description of what Daenerys experiences while she is in the pyre, so the closest we are ever going to get to understanding the machinations at work inside of the pyre are through the dragon dream that tells her to surrender herself to the flames. This is her second dragon dream in Dany 3, A Game of Thrones. "She opened her arms to the fire, embraced it, let it swallow her whole, let it cleanse her and temper her and scour her clean. She could feel her flesh sear and blacken and slough away. could feel her blood boil and turn to steam, and yet there was no pain. She felt strong and new and fierce. This dream tells her that if she surrenders to the fire, she will be burned away and reborn. And we witness that. Ser Jorah Mormont found her amidst ashes, glowing embers. She was naked, covered with soot, her clothes turned to ash, her beautiful hair all crisped away. She was unhurt. The significance of her being naked and bald cannot be overstated, because this is such an indicator of the rebirth that has happened. This excerpt is from Brienne 6 of A Feast for Crows. "We are all born naked, so I suppose it was only fitting that I come into my second life that way." And that is from the elder brother of the Sept. In Tyrion 2, A Dance with Dragons, Illyrio says, "Daenerys was half a child when she came to me, such a fearful, furtive thing. If truth be told, I did not think she would survive for long amongst the horse lords. The frightened child who sheltered in my manse died on the Dothraki Sea and was reborn in blood and fire. This dragon queen who wears her name is a true Targaryen." So something that we're going to discuss at length when we dig deeper into the mythos and the parallels between the forging of Lightbringer and the birthing of the dragons is that this death, Daenerys, what was the frightened child that we knew to be Daenerys Targaryen, she dies in the pyre. And that self-sacrifice, which was willing, she embraced it, is what births Drogon specifically. She dies, becomes Drogon, essentially, becomes Lightbringer, and is reborn as Azor Ahai. She walks into the pyre as Nissa Nissa, and she emerges from the pyre as Azor Ahai, wielding Lightbringer. And all of this being successful hindered upon her willingness to surrender her. So going back to this second version of the prophecy that we're given, we're told that this rebirth of Azor Ahai will happen amidst salt and smoke. And Melisandre, she takes this to mean Dragonstone because it's volcanic and it's an island. So you've got smoke and you've got salt. And we know that Dany was born there. So even if she is correct in the assumption that it's Dragonstone, I'll get into why I don't think that's correct. But even if we assume that to be correct, that also fits Daenerys. For me, Daenerys was not born as Azor Ahai on Dragonstone. She was born as Daenerys Targaryen on Dragonstone. It is in the pyre that she sacrifices herself and is reborn as Azor Ahai, born again. So the smoke is the pyre, and we get tendrils of curling smoke. The salt refers to Daenerys' tears that she sheds for the sacrifices she has to make in order for this to work. She wept for her child, the promise of a sweet mouth on her breast, but her tears turned to steam as they touched her skin. Then, she had wept in her dream, and the tears had turned to steam on her cheeks. And again, by the end, she had bathed him in her tears, and that is just before she mercy kills Drogo, sacrifices him. She bathes her sacrifice in her tears, including herself, because she is one of the sacrifices. To wake dragons out of stone. There are a few things I want to say and point out here. One, dragons is plural. It's not talking about waking a dragon, one specific person. It's plural. It's waking multiple dragons from stone. The second thing I want to say is that quickening petrified eggs and bringing forth living dragons from them is not literally bringing stone dragons to life. Literally bringing stone dragons to life is what Melisandre and Stannis were trying to do on Dragonstone with the dragon gargoyle figurines that are there. Melisandre took that shit very literally. The quickening of stone petrified eggs is not literal. All that said, let's get into waking dragons. Well, the waking of the dragons ultimately culminates and requires blood sacrifice. Only death can pay for life. We do see a subtle, a slow awakening of the eggs to Daenerys in correlation with the dragon dreams that she has throughout A Game of Thrones. In Dany 3 in A Game of Thrones, it says, she touched one, the largest of the three, Drogon, running her hand lightly over the shell. Black and scarlet, she thought, like the dragon in my dream. The stone felt strangely warm beneath her fingers. Dany is waking to the kinetic life that exists within these eggs. Several pages later, Dany saw a finger of dusty red light reach out to touch her dragon's eggs across the tent. For an instant, 1,000 droplets of scarlet flame swam before her eyes. Stone, she told herself, they're only stone. The stone was warm, almost hot. Another, as if somehow she were drawing strength from the stone dragons locked inside. Her arms were wrapped tight around a dragon's egg, and Dany could feel the heat of it. Deep in the stone, she felt something twist and stretch in response. These eggs are quickening. And then in a Samuel chapter, Samuel 1, A Feast for Crows, he thinks, even if he has an egg, Stannis, how can he hope to quicken it? Another thing worth note is how waking dragons from stone is such a play on King Arthur pulling Excalibur from the stone, which absolutely reinforces this idea that dragons are George's metaphor for swords. Another thing of note is that the difference between these two versions of the prophecy is that one mentions Lightbringer while the other mentions dragons. Why doesn't the one that mentions dragons also mention Lightbringer? And why doesn't the one that mentions Lightbringer also mention dragons? Well, it's because they're the same thing. This excerpt is from Davos 4, A Storm of Swords. It's Melisandre speaking. Soon comes the cold and the night that never ends, unless true men find the courage to fight it, men whose hearts are fire. She goes on to say, a king's blood. Only a king's blood can wake the stone dragon. Then, Westeros must unite beneath her one true king, the prince that was promised, Lord of Dragonstone and chosen of R'hllor. So let's break down all the ways that this is describing Daenerys. First, we have men whose hearts are fire. I'm just going to be running through some excerpts from the books that demonstrate this for Daenerys. This is a quote, Dany 1, A Game of Thrones, Viserys speaking. Ours is the house of the dragon, he would say. The fire is in our blood. Dany 7, A Game of Thrones. See how fierce she grows? It is my son inside her, the stallion who mounts the world, filling her with his fire. But we know that Dany is the stallion, and this is her own fire. She is filled with fire. And somewhat related, in Dany 9, a terrible burning in her womb. Her son, tall and proud, with Drogo's copper skin and her own silver gold hair, violet eyes, shaped like almonds. But when he opened his mouth, fire poured out. She saw his heart burning through his chest. She wept for her child, but the tears turned to steam on her cheek. She felt sad, and yet she could feel Rhaego receding from her as if he had never been. Dany 9, A Game of Thrones. And she saw her brother Rhaegar mounted on a stallion as black as his armor. Fire glimmered red through the narrow eye slit of his helm. The last dragon, the last. Dany lifted his polished black visor. The face within was her own. Dany 10. The heat beat at the air with great red wings, driving the Dothraki back, driving off even Mormont. But Dany stood her ground. She was the blood of the dragon. The fire was in her. No, my good knight, do not fear for me. The fire is mine. I am Daenerys Stormborn, daughter of dragons, bride of dragons, mother of dragons. Don't you see? Dany 4, Clash of Kings. Dany raised the glass to her lips. She could feel tendrils spreading through her chest like fingers of fire coiling around her heart. So the next bit from what Melisandre said is, only a king's blood can wake the stone dragon. Dany 1, A Game of Thrones. The line must be kept pure, Viserys had told her 1,000 times. Theirs was the king's blood, the golden blood of old Valyria, the blood of the dragon. Look at her. That silver gold hair, those purple eyes. She is the blood of old Valyria, no doubt, and high-born, daughter of the old king, sister to the new. Dany 2, A Game of Thrones. I am blood of the dragon, she told herself. I am Daenerys Stormborn, princess of Dragonstone, of the blood and seed of Aegon the Conqueror. Daenerys was the last, the very last. She was the seed of kings and conquerors, and so too the child inside her. She must not forget. Like, do we get the picture? She definitely has king's blood, and she woke stone dragons. Another interesting little bit In John 1, A Dance with Dragons, he overhears a conversation. 2 kings to wake the dragon, the father first and then the son, so both die kings. The words had been murmured by one of the queen's men. Aemon had demurred, there is power in king's blood. And I think this is really interesting because Drogo was a Khal, which is a king, and Rhaego, as Daenerys' son, is the rightful male heir, like if you're going by that system of monarchy. And then just the way that Rhaego, his sacrifice is what sustains Drogo long enough to become a sacrifice for the dragons. Like, it's just, George is so good. So then we get the prince that was promised. And this is how we learn that Melisandre believes the prince who was promised and Azor Ahai to be the same person. The difference is that the Azor Ahai prophecy originates in Essos, and the prince who was promised prophecy appears to have originated in Westeros, which means that it's just a different version of the Azor Ahai prophecy because the Azor Ahai prophecy is much, much older. And so something that we will discuss at the end of this Azor Ahai series is the ways in which I am certain that the prince who was promised, Azor Ahai, and the stallion who mounts the worlds are 3 versions of the same prophecy, and they are all referring to Daenerys, the 3 heads of the dragon, the child of 3. So first, let's talk about what we know of where the prince who was promised prophecy came from. And this is in Dany 4, A Dance with Dragons. She's talking to Barristan and asking about her parents. Why did they wed if they did not love each other? Barristan says, your grandsire commanded it. A woods witch had told him that the prince who was promised would be born of their line, meaning of Aerys and Rhaella's line. So this is a big part of why Rhaegar and others thought that the prophecy referred to him initially. So we get the kind of origin story of this prophecy in A Dance with Dragons, but the first time that we are interacting with that prophecy in Dany's story is in A Clash of Kings in the House of the Undying, and she sees Rhaegar, Elia, and Elia holding their child Aegon, and he's an infant. Aegon, he said to a woman nursing a newborn babe, what better name for a king? He has a song. He is the prince that was promised, and his is the song of ice and fire. So this is Rhaegar evolving in his thought process that it is not him, it is his son Aegon. He looked up when he said it, and his eyes met Dany's, and it seemed as if he saw her there standing beyond the door. There must be one more. The dragon has 3 heads. I have been screaming from the mountains that what is happening here is that Dany is seeing Rhaegar in the past at the same time that Rhaegar is seeing Dany and Drogon in the future. Because Drogon is with Dany on her shoulder in the House of the Undying. And what I believe is that when he looks up and he sees her and he said, there must be one more, the dragon has 3 heads, he thinks that Daenerys is his future daughter, his Visenya, if you will. Because he thinks the dragon has 3 heads is referring to a recreation of the conquerors through his children. But it's not. It's referring to Dany and her 3 dragons, the child of 3. So because he has this vision where he sees Daenerys, who he assumes is his daughter, Visenya, that is when he sets out to have a child with Lyanna Stark, fire and ice, all of that, all the ways that he's trying to force this prophecy. But instead of a Visenya, he gets Jon. And it was always going to be his baby sister who completed this prophecy. So yes, the prince who was promised and Azor Ahai are 2 versions of the same prophecy. They are both referring to Daenerys. Because really the only qualification right now to be the prince who was promised is to be of Rhaella and Aerys' line, which she is their direct descendant. She's their child. And something worth noting here is that in the Stallion Who Mounts the World prophecy, it says, fierce as a storm, this prince shall be. So they refer to him as a prince. This is a prophecy, which is a promise. The Stallion Who Mounts the World is a promised prince. So going to the last 2 monikers that Melisandre assigns Azor Ahai, Lord of Dragonstone and Chosen of R'hllor. Daenerys was born on Dragonstone, and she is the rightful princess of Dragonstone. Davos 5, A Storm of Swords. It's a conversation between Melisandre and Stannis. All you lack are dragons. The look Stannis gave her was dark. 9 mages crossed the sea to hatch Aegon III's cache of eggs. Baelor the Blessed prayed over his for half a year. Aryan Brightflame drank wildfire to transform himself. The mages failed, King Baelor's prayers went unanswered, Prince Aryan died screaming. And then Melisandre responds, "None of these were the chosen of R'hllor. No red comet blazed across the heavens to herald their coming. None wielded Lightbringer, the red sword of heroes. And none of them paid the price. Only death can pay for life." So, in breaking this down piece by piece and how it fits Dany, first we get chosen of R'hllor, which I have already covered in previous parts. I'm not going to repeat that here. No red comet blazed across the heavens to herald their coming. Dany 10, A Game of Thrones. Yogo spied it first. "There," he said in a hushed voice. Dany looked and saw it low in the east. The first star was a comet, burning red. Blood red, fire red, the dragon's tail. She could not have asked for a stronger sign. Then she goes on to light the pyre. Dany 2, A Clash of Kings. The Dothraki named the comet the Bleeding Star. Daenerys Targaryen had seen it first on the night she had burned Khal Drogo, the night her dragons had awakened. "It is the herald of my coming," she told herself as she gazed up into the night sky with wonder in her heart. Dany 2, A Clash of Kings. On the walls of Qarth, men beat gongs to herald her coming. Then, later, the Bleeding Star led me to Qarth, where she was heralded. Then, in the House of the Undying, 1,000 years ago we knew and have been waiting all this time. We sent the comet to show you the way. The comet was 1,000% the herald of Dany, her dragons, and the return of magic to the world. The return of fire magic to the world. So the next bit that we get is wielded Lightbringer, the red sword of heroes, which we have already discussed in previous parts, and again, I'm not going to cover that here. But Drogon is Lightbringer, born of Daenerys' blood sacrifice, and he fits the description of Valyrian steel of flame. So then Melisandre goes on to say in Davos 6 of A Storm of Swords, "You are he who must stand against the other, the one whose coming was prophesied 5,000 years ago. The red comet was your herald. You are the prince that was promised, and if you fail, the world fails with you." So we just discussed the red comet as Dany's herald. And in previous parts, we discussed the way that Melisandre uses Azor Ahai and the prince who was promised interchangeably, and how I also agree that they are referring to the same person, along with the stallion who mounts the world prophecy, which is what this series will conclude with, is tying those 3 prophecies together. I want to wrap up this series by talking about Melisandre as a character and how she's fallible and she exists as a character to be a cautionary tale against meddling in prophecy. And Rhaegar exists in a very similar capacity as a character. Davos 5, A Storm of Swords. Melisandre speaking. "If sometimes I've mistaken a warning for a prophecy or a prophecy for a warning, the fault lies in the reader, not the book." Then in Jon 1, A Dance with Dragons, Jon asks her, "Are your fires never wrong?" "Never, though we priests are mortal and sometimes err, mistaking this must come for this may come." And then in her POV chapter in A Dance with Dragons, she thinks to herself, "Many a priest and priestess before her had been brought down by false visions, seeing what they wished to see instead of what the Lord of Light sent." It's called confirmation bias. And just the dramatic irony that that creates for us and for her as a character, that she is speaking this aloud, this super sage advice, and she can't for a moment reflect that back on herself. And that she can sit here and think that there are dangers in interpreting visions and dangers in prophecy, but not for me somehow. We are given a really, really good example of Melisandre misreading a warning as a call to action. And then in acting, she manifests what she saw in the vision. Davos 2, A Clash of Kings. Melisandre saw another in her flames as well, a morrow where Renly rode out of the south in his green armor to smash my host beneath the walls of King's Landing. So she has this vision, they make a shadow baby, send that baby to kill Renly, but what happens? it makes an enemy of Loras Tyrell, who then wears Renly's armor in his battle against Stannis after uniting with the Lannisters. Davos 2, A Storm of Swords, so this is a book later. King Renly's shade was seen as well. It said his green armor took a ghostly glow from the wildfire, and his antlers ran with golden flames. So not only does Melisandre tell us that she can fuck up, she actively demonstrates fucking up. The nail in the coffin for Melisandre as someone who is fallible and unreliable and should not be used as a source of but this could happen, is from Maester Aemon's mouth, and he's one of the most sage characters in the series, and this is in a Samuel chapter in Feast for Crows. It must be you. Tell them. The prophecy, my brother's dream. Lady Melisandre has misread the signs. Stannis. We all deceive ourselves when we want to believe. Melisandre most of all, I think. The sword is wrong. She has to know that. Light without heat and empty glamour. The sword is wrong, and the false light can only lead us deeper into darkness, Sam. Daenerys is our hope. Tell them that at the Citadel. Make them listen. We are going to circle back to Lightbringer needing to produce its own heat when we talk about the Mythos, which is coming. But the purpose of that excerpt here is to demonstrate that a very reliable character, a very wise character, is solidifying what we've already seen and what we've been told from Melisandre herself, which is that she's wrong. And instead, Aemon thinks that Azor Ahai is Daenerys. Maester Aemon also says, no one ever looked for a girl, he said. It was a prince that was promised, not a princess. Rhaegar, I thought. The smoke from the fire that devoured Summerhall on the day of his birth, the salt from the tears shed for those who died. He shared my belief when he was young, but later he became persuaded that it was his own son who fulfilled the prophecy. For a comet had been seen above King's Landing on the night that Aegon was conceived, and Rhaegar was certain the bleeding star had to be a comet. And it's just, I love how they were right, but they were wrong. The salt is the tears shed for those who died in Daenerys' case, and the comet was the bleeding star, one of them, in Daenerys' case. Then he says, what fools we were who thought ourselves so wise. The air crept in from the translation. Dragons are neither male nor female. Barth saw the truth of that, but now one and now the other, as changeable as flame. The language misled us for 1,000 years. Daenerys is the one, born amidst salt and smoke. The dragons prove it. And then, of course, you had recently George confirming, quote, Septon Barth had much of it right. And speaking of characters more reliable than Melisandre, who believe that Daenerys Targaryen is Azor Ahai, there is also Benerro, who is the head, the leader of the Red Temple, of the Red Priests and Priestesses. Tyrion 6, A Dance with Dragons. Dragons have come to carry her, Daenerys, to glory. Benerro has sent forth the word from Volantis. Her coming is the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy. From smoke and salt she was born to make the world anew. She is Azor Ahai returned, and her triumph over darkness will bring a summer that never ends. Just because the Red Temple knows that Dany is Azor Ahai does not mean that that is good or that they are good. But that is a whole other video and a whole other conversation. But that's it for the prophecy portion. We are going to be going into the mythos, which is going to be awesome. That's coming in part 5 and however many parts it takes after that to get through it.